When my wife and I first bought the house, there was this basement. It wasn't anything special, a simple, dusty space that had clearly seen better days. The door was a pain, constantly getting stuck, and I could tell right away it hadn't been used much by the previous owners. To be honest, I was fine with that. I'd always been the type to keep things in order, to make sure nothing got out of control. My grandmother was a hoarder, and I remember how her house was filled with useless junk. She kept everything, and I learned early on that I never wanted to live like that. I liked things clean, practical, and without excess. The basement, with its sticky door and musty smell, just wasn't a place that fit into that picture. My wife, on the other hand, never really bothered with the basement. She's always had a fear of the dark, so naturally, she avoided the place. She never wanted to go down there, and it suited me fine, less stuff ending up in storage, less clutter to deal with. It was a silent understanding between us, the basement was a forgotten corner of our home. There were plenty of other rooms in the house that we used, and I didn't mind that we essentially ignored that one entirely. Life was easier that way, keeping everything neat and on track. We settled into our routine, and the basement stayed untouched. Occasionally, I'd think about fixing the door, making it easier to open and close, but it was never a priority. There wasn't anything we needed to store down there, so why bother? It was the kind of thing that could wait, and I had enough other projects around the house that actually mattered. We lived comfortably, and I liked it that way, everything had its place, and nothing was left to chance. Then one day, everything changed. It started when my wife's friend decided to drop by for a visit. She was the kind of person who loved to talk, and once she got started, there was no stopping her. That particular day, she had one topic on her mind: her parents had decided to get a horse. Yes, a horse. As a household pet. I couldn't wrap my head around it. She went on and on about it, explaining how they had space in their yard and how they'd always dreamed of having one. She was thrilled, even talking about how she'd signed up for horseback riding lessons. The more she talked, the more it became clear that this wasn't just a passing interest for her. It was her new obsession. She kept mentioning how wonderful it was, how much she loved spending time with the horse, and how it was such a great experience. I stayed mostly quiet, letting her ramble while my wife listened attentively. I could tell my wife was interested, or at least amused by the whole thing. She smiled and nodded, occasionally throwing in a question or a comment, but mostly, she just listened. Eventually, the conversation shifted. The friend started suggesting that my wife should think about getting involved too. She talked about how great it would be if they could do it together, how much fun they'd have riding and learning about horses. She was relentless, barely pausing for a breath as she tried to convince my wife to join her. I watched my wife's face as she listened. She looked intrigued, but I could also see the hesitation. It wasn't the kind of decision you make lightly, especially considering the costs and the commitment involved. I stayed out of it, just listening, curious to see where the conversation would go. After what felt like hours, it was finally time for her to leave. We walked her out, and I was more than happy to help her into a taxi. I needed some peace and quiet after all that talking. But before she left, she made one last pitch to my wife. She told her to think about it, to really consider the idea of joining her in this new hobby. She was convinced that it would be an amazing experience for both of them. I could see my wife was still on the fence, but she promised her friend that she'd think it over. Once the taxi drove away, I turned to my wife. She was deep in thought, clearly considering everything her friend had said. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Horses weren't exactly a part of our lifestyle, and I couldn't see how it would fit into our routine. But I kept my thoughts to myself, figuring it was better to let her come to her own conclusions. If she wanted to entertain the idea, that was her business. I'd wait until she made up her mind before weighing in. My wife spent the next week mulling over the whole idea. She talked to a few of her friends about it, trying to get a sense of what they thought. I could see it was on her mind, and she brought it up a few times with me too. It wasn't surprising. Once something got under her skin, she had a way of obsessing over it until she figured out what she wanted to do. Eventually, she came to me and said she thought it was actually a great idea. The only problem, she said, was that we didn't have anywhere to keep a horse. That was a pretty big hurdle, in my opinion, but she seemed determined to talk through it. The first thing I asked her was how she planned to pay for the horse. I mean, horses aren't cheap, and we had a budget to stick to. I wasn't about to let us blow a bunch of money on something like this without knowing all the details. She tried to reassure me, saying that it wasn't as expensive as I might think. To prove her point, she pulled out her phone, and we looked it up together. Sure enough, the prices ranged from $1,500 to $3,000. I had to admit, it was less than I expected, but still, it was a lot of money for something we didn't need. I told her, honestly, that I didn't think it was worth the investment. I'm not the kind of guy who spends money on a whim, especially not on something that requires as much care and upkeep as a horse. I suggested that if she was really interested, she could sign up at a local stable or, better yet, take her friend up on the offer to join her for lessons. It seemed like a much more practical solution to me. She'd get to enjoy riding without all the responsibility that came with owning a horse. Plus, we wouldn't have to figure out where to keep the thing. She was clearly disappointed. I could see it in her face. She tried to hide it, but I know her too well. She'd gotten her hopes up, and now she had to come to terms with the fact that owning a horse just wasn't in the cards for us. I felt a little bad, but I knew I was making the right call. Sometimes you have to be the voice of reason, even if it means letting someone down. She nodded eventually, saying she understood and that maybe it wasn't such a bad idea to just take lessons for now. She admitted that she really wanted her own horse, that it was something she'd always dreamed about. But she also said that maybe this was a good compromise. She could still ride and spend time around horses without the huge commitment. I could tell she was trying to make the best of it, and I appreciated that. She wasn't the type to dwell on disappointment for too long. Once she made up her mind, she moved forward. That evening, she decided to call her friend. She told her about our conversation, and from what I could hear, her friend was more than happy to have her join in on the lessons. In fact, she went a step further and invited us both over to see how everything was set up. She wanted to show us the stable, the horse, and everything else that went along with it. It was clear she was excited, and my wife seemed to be getting caught up in that excitement too. My wife hung up the phone, and she seemed in better spirits. She told me about the invitation, and I could see the spark of enthusiasm back in her eyes. She was looking forward to it, and while I wasn't exactly thrilled at the idea of spending my weekend looking at horses, I knew it was important to her. Sometimes, you have to do things for the people you care about, even if it's not your idea of a good time. I figured it couldn't hurt to see what all the fuss was about. She mentioned that her friend was inviting a few other people too, some mutual friends, as well as a couple of others from her riding lessons. It was going to be a bit of a gathering, not just a private tour. I wasn't sure how I felt about that, but I kept my mouth shut. It was her thing, and I didn't want to rain on her parade. I'd go along, see what it was all about, and that would be that. The weekend finally came, and my wife and I headed over to her friend's place. When we pulled up, I had to admit, it was an impressive setup. The house was large, bigger than I expected, and beside it was a neat little stable with a paddock. It was clear they had the space for a horse, and I couldn't help but crack a joke. I turned to my wife and asked, "So, you thought we could fit all this at our place, huh?" She rolled her eyes at me and told me to hush, a little smile on her face. I knew I was pushing her buttons, but sometimes I just couldn't help myself. We parked, and her friend came out to greet us. She introduced us to everyone who was there, and right away, I noticed one guy who stood out. He was dressed head to toe in designer clothes, the kind of stuff that looks more like a fashion statement than anything practical. He had his face buried in his phone, barely paying attention to what was going on around him. I couldn't quite figure out why, but something about him just rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was the way he seemed so uninterested, like he had better things to do. I leaned over to my wife and asked who he was, but she just shrugged, saying she wasn't sure. It wasn't long before I decided to find out for myself. I walked over to him, trying to strike up a conversation, but he barely looked up from his phone. It was irritating, and before I knew it, I had enough. I casually spit on his fancy sneakers, not making a big scene, just enough to see if he'd finally look up and react. And react he did. He threw a fit, started yelling, but before things could escalate, my wife's friend jumped in to calm everyone down. Once the dust settled, we continued with the visit. Our host gave us a tour of the stable, showing off the horse and explaining all the work that went into caring for it. It was impressive, I'll give her that. She seemed to know her stuff, and I could tell my wife was soaking it all in. At one point, the friend pulled me aside, chuckling about what had happened earlier. She told me the guy was a close friend of her parents. Apparently, his father owned a construction company or something like that. She didn't seem too bothered by what I did, and honestly, I wasn't either. He had it coming. After that, we talked a bit more about the horse. I brought up my wife's idea about maybe getting one of her own, and we chatted about the realities of it, the cost, the care, all the logistics. It was a good conversation, and I could tell my wife was happy I was at least taking an interest, even if I wasn't on board with the idea just yet. At some point, my wife even got the chance to ride the horse, with her friend guiding her through it. She looked happy, and I couldn't help but smile a bit seeing her enjoy herself. But then there was that guy again. I couldn't help but notice how he kept trying to talk to my wife. He seemed to hover around her, always with some comment or question. I watched from a distance for a while, not liking the way he acted. He was too familiar, too comfortable around her. Eventually, I had enough of it. I walked over, cutting their conversation short, and made some remark about whether he'd remembered to clean his sneakers. He didn't say much, just gave me a look, but I could tell he got the message. After that, things seemed to settle down. My wife continued her ride, and I stood by, watching, making small talk with her friend. She was still enthusiastic about the whole idea, talking about how great it would be for my wife to come by regularly. I listened, nodding along, but my mind kept drifting back to that guy. There was just something about him I didn't like, and I wasn't going to ignore it. I wasn't the type to make a scene, but I also wasn't the type to let something slide if it didn't sit right with me. Eventually, my wife finished up, and we all gathered around for a bit before calling it a day. The whole thing had gone well enough, despite a few hiccups. My wife was clearly excited, and I could see how much she was enjoying herself. I wasn't about to ruin that for her, so I kept my thoughts to myself. We thanked her friend for having us, and everyone started to head off in different directions. Once we got home, my wife wasted no time telling me how she thought I had acted out of line. She said I had been rude and that the guy was actually a nice person. I couldn't help but scoff at that. Nice guy? He's an arrogant jerk, I told her. There was no way I was going to let her think that someone like him was worth defending. She sighed, clearly frustrated with me, but I wasn't backing down. I knew what I saw, and I wasn't impressed by him in the slightest. She tried to smooth things over, saying it wasn't a big deal and that I was overreacting. Then she dropped a bit of a bombshell. Apparently, her friend and that guy were seeing each other, and not just casually. According to my wife, they were sleeping together, though she made it clear that this was just a rumor among the girls. I couldn't help but be taken aback by that. Well, that explains a lot, I said, shaking my head. She's not exactly lucky in that department if that's who she's with. My wife then filled me in on more details. It turns out that everything her friend had, the stable, the horse, all of it, was thanks to this guy's father. Apparently, the whole setup was a gift from him. It made more sense now why this guy was always hanging around and why he seemed so full of himself. He was living off his dad's money, playing the big shot. It was starting to add up, and I couldn't help but feel even less impressed by him. But then my wife changed the subject, and her mood seemed to lift. She had some good news. She and her friend had worked out a schedule, and they were going to start taking riding lessons together. She was excited about it, and I could see how much it meant to her. She'd been talking about horses non-stop ever since that visit, and now she had a plan in place. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea of her spending more time around that guy, but I knew it wasn't my place to tell her what she could or couldn't do. If this was something she wanted, I wasn't going to stand in her way. I nodded and told her that if it made her happy, then she should go for it. She smiled, and I could see some of the tension between us start to fade. We spent the rest of the evening looking at riding gear online, trying to figure out what she needed. I wanted her to be prepared, and if she was going to do this, I wanted her to have the best equipment we could afford. We ended up picking out a helmet, some riding boots, and a few other bits and pieces she'd need. It was nice, just sitting there with her, planning for something she was excited about. Finally, as we were lying in bed, she mentioned that she had already made plans with her friend. She was going to head over there that weekend to start her lessons. I nodded, telling her that it sounded like a good plan. I wasn't going to get in the way of her excitement. 2 weeks went by, and my wife had been going to her riding lessons regularly. She seemed genuinely happy, and I was glad she found something she enjoyed, even if it wasn't exactly my kind of thing. One evening, she came to me with a bit of hesitation in her voice. She said, "Don't get upset, but they're coming over for a barbecue this weekend." I knew exactly who she meant. I wasn't thrilled at the idea of having her friend and that guy over, especially considering how the last encounter went. But I could tell it mattered to her, so I nodded and said, "All right, let's do it." I decided that if we were going to do this, I'd do it right. I went out and got the best meat I could find, and I pulled out my favorite recipe. If I was going to host these people, I was going to make sure everything was done perfectly. The day of the barbecue came, and sure enough, they showed up in a shiny new Mercedes. I couldn't help but roll my eyes a little. It was just like him to make a show out of everything. From the moment he stepped out of the car, I could feel my irritation building. He started making little comments about our house, subtle digs that were clearly meant to get under my skin. I tried to ignore it, focusing on getting the grill ready and making sure everything was set up. But it didn't take long before he started criticizing my cooking. He took a bite of the meat and immediately started complaining that it was too bland, that it wasn't seasoned properly. I just stood there, watching him, feeling the anger simmering inside me. I didn't need to say anything, though. My wife and her friend were happily eating, and I could see that they were enjoying the food. Her friend had nearly finished her entire plate, and my wife gave me a reassuring smile. It was enough to shut him up for a while, but the damage was done. He'd left a sour taste in my mouth. After the initial tension, things seemed to calm down a bit. We all sat down to have some tea, and the conversation shifted to safer topics. Or at least, that's what I thought. But it turns out, this guy only had one thing he wanted to talk about: horses. He went on and on about how many stables his dad had built, how great he was at riding, and how, once he inherited everything, he was going to build the biggest racetrack anyone had ever seen. I just sat there, nodding occasionally, but in my head, I couldn't help but think that these were just his wild fantasies. It was clear he loved the sound of his own voice, and I wasn't interested in getting into it with him. The longer the evening went on, the more I noticed something that bothered me even more. He kept glancing over at my wife. It wasn't just casual looks, he seemed to be watching her, like he was waiting for something. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but it kept happening, and it was starting to get under my skin. I decided to keep an eye on him, not wanting to make a scene, but also not willing to let it slide completely. At one point, I caught him staring again, and I decided to confront him, in my own way. I asked him directly, "Is there something you're looking at?" He seemed a bit caught off guard, but he quickly recovered and said he was just admiring the necklace my wife was wearing. He said it was beautiful and asked if it had any special meaning. I didn't like the way he was talking, but I kept my cool. My wife just smiled politely and thanked him, but I could tell she was a little uncomfortable too. As the evening went on, I did my best to keep things civil. I didn't want to ruin the night for my wife, especially since she was having a good time with her friend. But every time that guy opened his mouth, it was either to brag about himself or to make some comment that rubbed me the wrong way. I could see why my wife's friend might be interested in him. He had money, connections, all the things that some people find attractive. But to me, he was just an arrogant kid who had never worked for anything in his life. Eventually, it was time for everyone to leave. I could feel the tension easing as we started to wrap things up. My wife and her friend were chatting happily, and I was just counting down the minutes until they were gone. As they were getting ready to leave, I made sure to stay close to my wife, keeping an eye on that guy. He tried to make a few more comments, but I wasn't really listening anymore. I just wanted them gone so we could get back to our normal lives. After they finally left, I turned to my wife and let out a long sigh. I couldn't keep quiet any longer. "What was that all about?" I asked, my frustration evident. That guy was completely out of line. He insulted our home, talked down about my cooking, and didn't even bother to hide the way he was looking at you. I could feel my irritation bubbling up again just thinking about it. I wasn't the type to let things slide, especially when it came to my own home. I expected at least a little respect, but clearly, that wasn't something he was capable of giving. My wife just looked at me and shook her head. She wasn't taking it nearly as seriously as I was. "You're overreacting," she said, trying to calm me down. "You know how he is. It's just the way he talks. It's not worth getting worked up over." I could tell she wanted me to drop it, but it wasn't that easy for me. I wasn't just going to brush off the way he behaved, like it was nothing. Still, I took a breath and tried to let it go, if only for her sake. Honestly, though, she continued, "We all had a good time. You need to stop letting him get under your skin. It's like you two are just trying to prove something to each other, and it's pointless. You're both grown men, so maybe it's time you stopped acting like kids trying to see who's better." She was right, at least to some extent. I knew I was letting this guy get to me, but I couldn't help it. Something about him just set me off, and I didn't trust him one bit. But for my wife's sake, I tried to let it go. Then she dropped another piece of news on me. "By the way," she said casually, "he's going to be helping train me and my friend during our riding lessons." I blinked, caught off guard. "Wait, what?" I asked, trying to process what she was saying. The idea of that guy spending even more time around my wife wasn't exactly something I was thrilled about. But she just smiled, trying to reassure me. "It's not a big deal," she said. "He's good at what he does, and besides, my friend will be there too. It'll be fine." I didn't know how to respond at first. The thought of that guy being around my wife, acting like he knew everything, rubbing his arrogance in my face, it wasn't something I was excited about. But she seemed so relaxed about it, so confident that it would all be fine. I didn't want to be the one to ruin that for her. I knew how much these lessons meant to her, and I wasn't about to stand in the way of something she was passionate about, even if it meant putting up with that guy. I took a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. "All right," I finally said, though I could feel the reluctance in my own voice. "If you think it's going to be fine, then I'll trust you. But you know I don't like him, right? Just be careful, all right?" She smiled and nodded, coming over to give me a quick hug. "I know," she said. "But really, it'll be fine. You have nothing to worry about." I wasn't entirely convinced, but I decided to let it go. If she believed it would all work out, then I'd give her the benefit of the doubt. As a sailor, my life has always been divided between long stretches at sea and shorter periods of time at home. My leave had come to an end, and it was time for me to head out on another 4-month deployment. I've always taken pride in my work, the routine, the responsibility, the sense of purpose that comes with being at sea. But saying goodbye to my wife was never easy, especially now with all the recent events. Still, I gave her a tight hug, asking if she planned to keep up with her riding lessons. She smiled and reassured me that she'd keep going, that everything was fine and she'd keep herself busy while I was away. I nodded, trusting her words, and soon enough, I was on the ship, ready to face the months ahead. The first few weeks of the voyage went smoothly, as they usually did. There's something calming about being out on the open water, the routine, the hard work, the straightforward nature of life on a ship. But then something caught my attention, something that didn't sit right with me. I noticed some charges on my bank account. At first, they were small, almost easy to miss, but they kept appearing. They weren't anything I recognized, and I knew I hadn't been spending money while out at sea. It was strange, and it left me with a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. As the days passed, the charges continued, and they started to grow. It wasn't just the small amounts anymore. One day, I saw a $2,000 withdrawal. That got my attention right away. I knew something wasn't right. I tried not to jump to conclusions, but it was hard not to worry. Another $1,000 disappeared shortly after that, and I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I found some time during a break and made the call back home to my wife. I needed to understand what was happening, and I wasn't willing to just wait and see. When I got her on the phone, I asked directly about the charges. I didn't have time for small talk, I needed answers. She sounded a bit flustered, and I could tell she hadn't expected me to notice so quickly. She said she'd gotten into a bit of an unpleasant situation, but she assured me that everything was fine now. She promised she'd pay back the money from her own savings, and that there was no need to worry. She even hinted that there might be a surprise waiting for me when I got back home. I didn't know what to make of it. The whole thing sounded off, and I could feel my gut telling me that something wasn't right. It's not that I didn't trust my wife, I've always believed in her, and I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. But the explanations she gave me didn't quite add up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Out here on the ship, I had no way of digging deeper or figuring out what was really going on. I was stuck with the information I had, and that was frustrating. I've always been the kind of guy who likes to take action, to deal with problems head on, but out here, I was powerless. After 4 long months at sea, it was finally time to head home. I was more than ready. I missed my wife, missed our home, and I couldn't wait to be back. I thought it would be a great idea to surprise her, just show up unannounced and see her reaction. I imagined her face lighting up, the happiness in her eyes when she saw me standing at the door. So, I kept my return a secret and drove straight home, feeling a mix of excitement and anticipation as I pulled into the driveway. When I got to the door, I knocked and waited, expecting her to open it with a big smile. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no sound from inside. I waited a minute, then knocked again, a bit louder this time. Still nothing. I checked my watch and figured maybe she was in the middle of something. I decided to give it a few more minutes, hoping she'd come to the door. After about 5 minutes, I finally heard her voice from inside, yelling, "Just a second." She sounded flustered, like she was rushing around, and it caught me off guard. Something felt off, but I tried to brush it aside. When she finally opened the door, the look on her face wasn't exactly what I had pictured. She looked surprised, yes, but not in the happy, excited way I had imagined. Instead, she seemed almost shocked, like she wasn't sure what to do. "Oh, you're home, now," she stammered, clearly caught off guard. She tried to smile, but there was something about her expression that didn't sit right with me. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I knew something was off. I tried to step inside, but she quickly put her hand on the doorframe, blocking me for a moment. "Wait, just hold on a second," she said, her voice shaky. I frowned, confused. "Why can't I come in?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She mumbled something about not being ready, about the house being a mess, and I could hear the panic in her voice. It was strange, and I couldn't help but feel a growing unease. She was acting like she had something to hide, and I didn't like it one bit. Eventually, she stepped aside, letting me in. I walked in slowly, glancing around, trying to figure out what was going on. The house looked fine to me, and nothing out of place, nothing unusual. I turned back to her, raising an eyebrow, but she just gave me a nervous smile, like she was trying to pretend everything was normal. I decided not to push it, at least not right away. I was tired from the trip, and all I wanted was a little bit of normalcy after being away for so long. We talked for a bit, but it felt forced. She asked about my trip, and I gave her the highlights, trying to ignore the weird vibe in the air. She kept glancing around, her eyes darting toward the hallway, like she was distracted. I couldn't figure out what was going on with her, but I didn't have the energy to confront it right then and there. I just wanted to relax, to feel like I was home again, even if something felt off. I hoped that whatever was bothering her would come out eventually, but for now, I let it slide. After a while, I could feel the exhaustion catching up with me. The long journey, the stress of the past few months, and now the strange tension at home, it was all weighing on me. I told her I needed to get some rest, and she nodded, almost looking relieved. She showed me to the bedroom, and I could see her visibly relax as I made my way in. I wasn't sure what that was about, but I was too tired to care. I figured I'd deal with whatever was going on later. I lay down on the bed, closing my eyes and trying to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. I wanted to believe that it was just my imagination, that maybe I was overthinking things after being away for so long. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something was off, and I was going to get to the bottom of it. But for now, all I needed was sleep. I'd figure out everything else in the morning. The next morning, I got up feeling slightly better after a good night's sleep. I figured it was time to get some answers about that surprise my wife had mentioned when I called her during the voyage. So, as we were having breakfast, I asked her, "So, what about that surprise you talked about?" She paused for a moment, then gave me a half smile, saying, "Oh, it hasn't arrived yet. It's actually from my friend. Just something small, but you'll see it soon." I nodded, trying to read her expression. There was still something guarded about her, but I didn't push it. I decided to let it be for now. I then brought up the money that had disappeared from my account. I needed to know what had happened, even if I had a vague idea already. She took a deep breath and told me that she'd been in a car accident, nothing too serious, but enough to leave her with some hefty bills for compensation and repairs. She explained that she had to use the money from my account to cover it all, and that was why I'd seen those charges. I listened carefully, processing what she was saying. It made sense, more or less, and I could tell she was trying to be honest. I wasn't happy about it, but I figured, well, my earnings from the voyage had come in, so what's done is done. After breakfast, I decided to go make myself a cup of coffee. It was something simple, something normal to ground myself after being away for so long. As I walked toward the kitchen, something caught my eye, the door to the basement. It was slightly ajar, which immediately struck me as odd. That door was always closed. In fact, it usually stuck so badly that you had to put some real muscle into opening it. I stopped in my tracks, staring at it for a moment, trying to figure out why it was open now. Something about it didn't sit right with me. I walked over to the door, inspecting it more closely. It looked different, like it had been worked on recently. The edges were smoother, and the hinges seemed newer. I could have sworn it hadn't looked like that before I left. I reached out, touching the door, and I felt a slight unease growing inside me. There was no reason for it to look this way unless someone had been messing with it while I was gone. I turned my head and called out to my wife, who was still in the kitchen, "Did you do something to the basement door while I was away? It looks different." She appeared in the hallway a moment later, her face a mix of surprise and something else I couldn't quite place. She walked over quickly, almost too quickly, and gently pulled the door shut. "I'd rather you didn't go down there right now," she said, her tone light but her eyes betraying a hint of nervousness. "There's really nothing to see. And honestly, I haven't had time to sort through the stuff down there. It's just a mess." I frowned, not entirely convinced. It wasn't like her to be this evasive, and it only made me more curious. I crossed my arms, watching her closely. "Why don't you want me going down there? It's just the basement. We've never kept anything important down there." She gave a small, strained laugh and shook her head. "Exactly. There's nothing important down there, just old junk. I just don't want you dealing with the mess right now. You just got back, let's focus on other things." I could feel my frustration starting to build, but I didn't want to turn this into a fight. Not after being away for so long. I took a deep breath, trying to let it go, even though my instincts were telling me that something wasn't adding up. She turned and started talking about her mom, mentioning that we needed to head over there soon for a planned visit. She was trying to change the subject, and I could see right through it. We should get ready to leave soon, she said, her voice a little too upbeat. My mom's expecting us, and we shouldn't keep her waiting. I watched her for a moment, debating whether or not to keep pressing about the basement. But I could tell she was getting anxious. Maybe I could have let it go. Maybe if everything had stayed quiet, I would have just moved on and put the whole thing out of my mind. But then, I heard it, a strange noise coming from downstairs. It wasn't just any noise, it sounded like an animal. I froze for a moment, straining my ears, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. There was no mistaking it, there was something alive down there. My gut twisted, and I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was seriously wrong, and I had to find out what. Without saying anything, I made my way toward the basement door, my steps quick and determined. I was done with the evasiveness, done with the excuses. As I reached for the door, my wife appeared out of nowhere, grabbing my arm. "Don't," she said, her voice urgent, almost pleading. "There's nothing down there." But I wasn't buying it. I shook her off, my patience finally gone. "I'm going down there," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. I pulled the door open and started down the stairs, ignoring her protests. As I descended, the smell hit me first, a heavy, earthy smell that definitely didn't belong in a basement. When I reached the bottom, I couldn't believe my eyes. Standing there, in the middle of our basement, was a damn horse. A live horse, surrounded by piles of hay. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. How in the hell had she gotten a horse down here? And why? I turned back, looking up at my wife, who was still standing at the top of the stairs, her face pale and her eyes wide. She didn't say anything, she just watched me, like she was waiting for my reaction. I stepped further into the basement, my eyes scanning the area. That's when I noticed it, the laptop, sitting on a small stool nearby. It seemed out of place, almost like it had been left there in a hurry. My instincts told me to check it out, so I walked over and opened it. What I found made my stomach turn. There were videos of my wife doing things with the horse that were beyond anything I could have imagined. Disgusting, twisted things. I felt my chest tighten, my mind going blank for a moment as I tried to process the sheer shock of it. There were no words, no thoughts, just a deep, overwhelming sense of revulsion. I pulled out my phone, my hand shaking slightly as I started recording what was on the screen. I needed proof. I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but I knew I needed to have it. My wife, realizing what I was doing, suddenly bolted down the stairs. She was holding something, and as she got closer, I saw it was a knife. Her face was a mask of panic and desperation. "Turn it off," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Get away from the laptop." She held the knife out in front of her, her hands trembling as she moved closer to me. I stood there, staring at her, trying to make sense of what was happening. This was the woman I'd married, the woman I'd loved, and now she was standing in front of me, threatening me with a knife over something so twisted and incomprehensible that I could barely wrap my mind around it. For a moment, I didn't move. I just looked at her, seeing the fear and desperation in her eyes. She wasn't thinking clearly, that much was obvious. But that didn't make this any less real, any less dangerous. Slowly, I raised my hands, trying to show her that I wasn't going to do anything rash. "All right," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos of emotions inside me. "I'm stepping away." I took a careful step back, away from the laptop, keeping my eyes on her the entire time. She watched me, her grip on the knife still tight, her breathing heavy. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the confusion and fear battling with whatever had driven her to this point. I knew I had to stay calm if I wanted to get out of this without anyone getting hurt. She nodded slightly, her eyes never leaving mine. "Let's go upstairs," she said, her voice shaky but with a hint of relief. I nodded back, taking another step away from the laptop and moving toward the stairs. She kept the knife pointed at me as we made our way back up, her movements jerky and uncertain. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I kept my face calm, my steps slow and deliberate. Whatever was happening, whatever had led us to this moment, I knew one thing: I needed to get us both out of that basement and away from the edge we were standing on. Standing in the living room, I knew I had to take control of the situation. The fear and confusion in my wife's eyes were almost unbearable, but I couldn't let myself lose focus. I had to keep us both calm and find a way to diffuse the tension. So, I decided to take a different approach. I softened my tone and tried to reassure her. I told her that none of this was worth destroying our lives over, that we could work it out somehow. I brought up some of the good times we'd shared, reminding her of the happy moments from our life together. I could see her starting to waver, her grip on the knife loosening as her emotions took over. Eventually, she let the knife fall to the floor, tears streaming down her face. She broke down, sobbing, and I could hear the desperation in her voice as she started talking. She confessed that it was all because of that guy, the rich friend of her friend. He had been the one to propose the twisted idea of a love triangle, and he was the one who had taught her those disgusting things involving the horse. She said that she had been feeling lonely while I was away, that she had been bored and missed me, and somehow, she had let herself get caught up in something so vile. I listened, a cold feeling settling deep in my gut as she poured out her side of the story. As I listened to her, my mind was already working on a plan. I knew, right then and there, that I couldn't stay. There was no coming back from this, no way to undo what had been done. I had to get out, and I had to do it soon. But for now, I kept my face calm and nodded along with what she was saying. I told her that it was okay, that we could try to move past it. I even suggested we sit down and have some tea, trying to give her a sense of normalcy, anything to keep her from suspecting what I was really planning. She seemed relieved, and the tension between us eased a bit as we moved through the rest of the day. We spent the rest of the day in a strange, forced calm. I acted like I had forgiven her, like I was willing to work things out. I couldn't let her see what I was really thinking. She talked about everyday things, trying to fill the silence with small talk, and I played along, nodding and responding where I needed to. But inside, my mind was racing, thinking through every detail of what I needed to do next. I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer than necessary. As soon as night fell and she was asleep, I would make my move. Later that night, once she had finally gone to bed, I waited for what felt like an eternity until I was sure she was asleep. Then, as quietly as I could, I got up and started gathering my things. I took only what I needed, a few clothes, my documents, and anything else essential. I found the cash we kept at home, along with some jewelry that I knew had value. I moved slowly, making sure not to make any noise that could wake her. I wasn't afraid of her, not exactly, but I didn't want another confrontation. I just wanted to get out without any more drama. With my bag packed, I made my way to the door. I glanced back once, seeing her still lying there, oblivious to what was happening. I turned away, opening the door and stepping outside. The night air hit me, cool and refreshing, and I took a deep breath. My car was still there, untouched, which told me all I needed to know about where the money from my account had gone. It had gone to that damn horse, to the twisted things she'd been doing while I was away. I felt a wave of anger, but I pushed it down. There would be time for that later. Right now, I just needed to leave. I drove to my best friend's house, my mind still reeling from everything that had happened. He opened the door, and one look at my face told him that this wasn't a social visit. He didn't ask any questions, he just let me in, offering me a place to stay for as long as I needed. I was grateful for that. I needed time to think, time to figure out what my next steps would be. But one thing was already clear to me: I was done with my marriage. There was no fixing what had been broken, no way to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. Over the next few days, I made arrangements to quietly file for divorce. I didn't want any more drama, didn't want any more confrontations. I just wanted to cut ties and move on with my life. Once the paperwork was ready, I mailed it to her, along with a simple note: I can't live like this. This is your burden now." It was the only way I knew how to end things. There was no point in trying to explain further. She knew what she had done, and she would have to live with it. As for me, I was ready to move forward, leaving all of this behind. It didn't take long for her to find me. Somehow, she figured out that I was staying at my friend's place, and one day, she showed up at his door. I was inside when I heard the knocking, and I knew immediately who it was. My heart sank, but I kept my expression blank. My friend answered the door, and there she was, angry, desperate, and ready to cause trouble. She started yelling, demanding to see me, her voice full of threats. I stayed out of sight, not saying a word. My friend simply told her to leave, then closed the door in her face. We waited, listening as she kept pounding on the door and shouting. My friend gave me a look that said it all. This was a mess, but he was standing by me, no matter what. We stayed silent, waiting her out. Eventually, the noise stopped, and we heard her footsteps retreating. I let out a long breath, trying to shake off the tension. I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. She was relentless, and I had no doubt that she would keep trying to find me. I had to do something before things escalated even further. The very next day, I packed up my things and left. I couldn't put my friend in that kind of position again. He'd done enough for me, and I needed to take responsibility for my own situation. I decided to move to another city, back to where my parents lived. It was the only place I could think of where I might have a chance to start over without her finding me. My parents welcomed me with open arms, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. I found a place to rent, a small, quiet house that was mine and mine alone. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For a while, it seemed like things were finally settling down. She couldn't find me, no matter how hard she tried. I heard through some mutual contacts that she was still looking for me, that she was refusing to accept the divorce. It didn't make any sense to me. We were done, legally and emotionally. But she just couldn't seem to let go. I kept my distance, staying away from any places where she might look for me. I needed time to heal, to put the pieces of my life back together without her interference. After a while, I decided to move back closer to my old friends, though I made sure to pick a different part of the city. I needed the support of the people who knew me best, but I also needed to feel safe. I chose a quiet neighborhood on the other side of town, far enough away that I felt like I could keep my life separate from the chaos she brought with her. I promised myself that if she ever tried to come after me again, I wouldn't just quietly walk away. I was done running, done hiding. If she pushed me, I would stand my ground and face whatever came my way.